name is Jose Valencia. I'm originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I am self-employed presently. I have 3 children who are adults and 1 who is a child. I worked for the City of Santa Fe Police Department from April of 2000 until February of 2010. I was a detective with the Criminal Investigations Division, Crimes Against Children Unit. For the first several years of my career, I was a patrol officer. Therefore, I had limited access to information, and I knew little more than the calls that I was dispatched to. I had no idea what the inner workings of the police department or city government entailed. It wasn't until I began serving on the police union and became lead negotiator for the negotiating team, and later became president of the union, I became privy to this information. I was never sworn to secrecy. I was never told that it was classified or esoteric information. I simply was exposed to the kind of criminal misconduct that has occurred and is continuing to occur, with the understanding that I was not to ever say anything. I was a low-level, low-ranking detective. I held no rank. And my superiors, not just my commanders, but the superiors at City Hall, who I answered to, like the city manager and the assistant city attorney and the mayor, there was a nonverbal communication between us such that they made it clear to me that if I dared to divulge any information that was discussed behind closed doors, that I would be retaliated against. At the time, I took their statements and innuendos as jokes. I never took it seriously.
He was fired for being a dirty cop, but he says it was a setup to get rid of him.
He was a 10-year veteran of the Santa Fe police force and the head of the union, but he lost it all after investigators say they caught him making dangerous deals with a well-known criminal.
They misunderstood and misread my personality profile and assumed that I would respond as would a regular police officer to intimidation. They had no clue that I do not respond that way to intimidation, and all that it would do is encourage me to expose their crimes.
Jose Valencia had taken on top brass at the Santa Fe PD about pay raises and fought to keep some officers on the force. Valencia also claims he blew the whistle on corruption higher up in the department. In February 2008, well-known drug dealer Maximiliano Gonzalez told investigators he could hand them a dirty cop, Jose Valencia, in exchange for a lighter sentence. Detectives made the deal and recorded phone conversations between the men. Santa Fe police say they caught Valencia on tape offering to sell a gun to Gonzalez. Valencia claims he was only talking to Gonzalez because he decided to investigate. The PD fired Valencia and he was stripped of his police certification a year ago. Not only does Valencia say he was set up, his attorneys say the whole undercover sting was illegal. The Santa Fe police chief and the mayor's office did not want to comment on this story.
The state also stripped Jose Valencia of his right to be a cop.
I have a personality flaw. Anyone that knows me can tell you that I do not respond well to bullies, and they essentially tried to bully me. And my response since I was a child has always been to meet bullies head on. The lead negotiator, the chief of police, the assistant city attorney, and other members of the city's negotiating team, all, including a captain, high-ranking captain, and a deputy chief, all threatened to ruin my career as a police officer, ruin my professional and personal reputation, and play it all out in the media so that nobody would ever hire me again. At the time, again, I thought it was a claim of false bravado. They were really pushing the limit at trying to scare me, and I was not impressed or intimidated, and I simply encouraged them to do their worst because I didn't believe that they had the wherewithal or the facility to accomplish all of that. I had no idea how politically connected the city of Santa Fe is, and that they could marshal political favors in from other agencies and high-ranking judges and officials to accomplish this character assassination that they performed on me. The accusations began soon after I reported criminal misconduct of police officers. Now keep in mind, as lead negotiator of the union, of the police union, and as president of the union, I was considered a very effective and very successful union representative because I could protect the rights of police officers during their disciplinary proceedings. I did it very well, and to the degree that police officers from other agencies that were not part of my union would call me for help when they were facing a disciplinary process. Now, keep in mind, I did not simply defend police officers who preyed upon the public. I did not empower them or enable them to continue their predation on the public or to victimize the public. All I simply did was ensure that the police officers' civil rights were adhered to and protected during the disciplinary process, which was simple, whether it was a tribunal with their agency or with the Department of Public Safety, if their certification was in question. I did not help cops avoid arrest for criminal misconduct or avoid discipline if in fact they did commit some kind of police misconduct. I simply made sure that their rights were protected and that their due process was followed, so they had the opportunity to defend themselves and protect themselves from any kind of weirdness that would go on in a tribunal, otherwise known as a kangaroo court. So that being said, it was after I began reporting the criminal misconduct of other cops at the Santa Fe Police Department that the accusations against me were brought up. And it's interesting because it's a classic tactic of these people that they love to accuse their enemies of the misconduct that they are actually committing. So the misconduct that I was accused of was actually the misconduct that was being committed by several of the narcotics and burglary officers. Yet they turned it on me and sold it to everybody that I was the one that was committing that level of misconduct. The police misconduct that I was exposed to that was occurring had to do with widespread civil rights violations, overtime fraud, governmental overtime fraud, embezzlement, and cops who were committing crimes under the color of law using qualified immunity as a defense. And I began reporting that. I reported it first to commanders, then I reported it to the chief of police, then I reported it to the city manager, then I reported it to the mayor. Each time I was told to stop reporting that, and any written reports that I made, I was told to retract and withdraw. I refused to do that because as a police officer, you take an oath to protect and serve, and primarily to protect the constitutional rights of everybody. That includes victims, witnesses, and suspects. There was an ongoing, repeated occurrence of civil rights violations, not only for suspects, witnesses, and victims. They were also occurring within the police department with city employees. There was a pattern of conduct whereby female officers were continually being sexually harassed by high-ranking commanders, and many of them approached me and asked for my help with addressing that because it wasn't specifically delineated or addressed within the collective bargaining agreement. There was only so much I could do as a union rep, as union president, and was told repeatedly by the former human resources director, Ray Rael, who became chief, that it was a non-union matter, that I needed to keep my nose out of it. So then what I would do is I would assist these female officers in completing EEOC complaints with respect to sexual harassment. The retaliation against witnesses that occurred as a result of that against these female officers was egregious and gross misconduct. And it was amazing how openly the commanders were allowed to simply retaliate against a witness who reported sexual harassment against a commander or a city official. And it was allowed. It was never addressed. The human resources investigator, who at the time was Raymond Rael, would simply cover it up and list it as unfounded without talking to a single witness or doing any kind of thorough or appropriate investigation. So essentially, cops were getting away with victimizing females there. Female cops were placed at a disadvantage, and any female cop that was vocal about it was immediately retaliated against. And there were a couple of lawsuits that were filed against the city of Santa Fe that I didn't follow them. I don't know what happened. But that was the beginning of the end for this character assassination that they crafted and enacted upon me. What they wanted to do was attack my credibility. Because at the time, I had a flawless work history, not a single reprimand in my file, nothing but letters of commendations and certificates of advanced police training were in my file. Not a single complaint from anybody, not from the public, not from other cops, not from anyone. I had a flawless work history. So I was a very credible police officer. And because I was so credible and trusted, people tended to believe me when I told the truth. Of course, I had no reason not to tell the truth. So I would just simply tell the truth if someone asked me a question, regardless of how horrible the truth was. So they needed to attack my credibility. And the method by which they attacked it and the method they chose was to simply call me a liar. And the only way they could do that was actually send me through an IA investigation and have the IA investigator determine that I lied in an internal affairs investigation. That way it would go on record with the Department of Public Safety that it was determined that I had lied and therefore I was a liar, my credibility was destroyed, and it didn't matter what I said, what criminal misconduct I reported that was occurring. They could always do the liar, pants on fire defense because he lied. That was their attack. But it didn't stop there. Not only did they have to make me look like a liar, they had to make me look like I was delusional. Like when I came forward with this story to divulge that the city of Santa Fe pulled in favors, political favors from many different agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Santa Fe County and Region 3, Narcotics Drug Task Force, Cricket, cell phones, the FBI. They wanted to make me sound like a conspiracy theorist, like I was delusional. However, I have enough documents and eyewitnesses to demonstrate that there is no way that I could marshal this kind of convoluted conspiracy theory and story, including all these esoteric and confidential details, unless it actually happened and there was evidence to back it up. And I do have documentary evidence and depositions by which these people confirm and prove that they were all brought in doing political favors for the city of Santa Fe Police Department in this character assassination to not only make me look like a liar, but to make me look like a dirty cop and a criminal who cannot be trusted, cannot be believed, and should not be employed by anybody ever again. Initially, in my IA file, the initial target letter stated that I was being investigated for general police misconduct, for failure to obey laws, which would imply, or doesn't imply, it just comes right out and says that I broke a law, that I committed criminal misconduct to some degree. So the third charge was that I was not forthcoming and I was dishonest. But that charge was added after the fact, after my interviews. So those were the initial allegations, and when I received my target letter, I was not impressed or concerned because I knew that I had not committed any criminal act and I knew that I had not committed police misconduct. I was notorious for following policy. Truth be told, I wrote most of those policies because I was lead negotiator. So I knew policy forward and backward. That was why I could defeat IA investigators and the city attorney's office every time we were in a tribunal and they tried to circumvent their own policies and meeting out some kind of personal vendetta from a commander and attack one of the officers. And I was able to use their own policies against them. So I knew, I was secure in the fact that those three allegations, well, the two initial ones, had no merit. So I wasn't really concerned. I knew it was their ploy to intimidate me and to cause fear and panic in me so that I would make mistakes that would benefit them, that would be to their advantage. Well, unfortunately, again, as I mentioned before, they did not do an accurate profile on me. That is not something that makes me afraid because somebody's threatening me. All that does is, at the time, not anymore, but at the time, all it did was make me angry. Which still was a mistake. I shouldn't have gotten so angry, but that's the honest truth. I simply got angry. So, to elaborate, the police misconduct that I was being accused of was simply that I had engaged in a 15-minute telephone conversation and a 2.5-minute telephone conversation with a confidential informant named Max Gonzalez, and that during these conversations I had agreed to provide him with a firearm after he had quote-unquote clearly conveyed to me that he intended to use said firearm to commit a murder. Now, the term clearly conveyed is important because if you listen to the recordings, and I'd be happy to provide one for you of the telephone conversations, he never says that he needs the gun to commit a murder, ever. That's why they had to use the term clearly conveyed, because in their opinion, it was clearly conveyed, even though he never actually says that he wants the gun to shoot anybody. He simply says that he needs a gun because his life has been threatened and his daughter's life has been threatened. And because I was a crimes against children investigator, those who put him up to it knew that if he threw his daughter in the mix, I would be more inclined to try to help this guy than to simply blow him off. So he threw his daughter in the mix, and that was right. That was why I helped him. I engaged in numerous conversations with him, not just one. I engaged with 7 to 10 conversations with him over a 5 to 6 month period. And during these conversations, we spoke about many different things, including firearms. At the end of my conversations with him, it was clear that I didn't believe that he really wanted a firearm, simply that to hurt anybody or for any reason other than to get me to provide him with a firearm. And I became suspicious. I reported it to my commanders and to other commanders immediately as soon as I got calls from this guy wanting a firearm. However, those who were working with Max as a confidential informant were able to get these conversations and do a very haphazard job of splicing parts of the conversations together such that to the casual listener and to the most ignorant of people with respect to law enforcement work, it may sound like I was going to give this guy a gun to shoot somebody with. Max Gonzalez, as I knew him at the time, was a confidential informant and nothing more. Because I was so well trusted by the narcotics officers and all the police officers in general, and because I spoke Spanish, I was very often brought in on certain cases. Therefore, I was introduced to many, many confidential informants, because a lot of times we had to work with the confidential informants who were doing controlled buys from suspects who spoke only Spanish. So Max Gonzalez was one of the confidential informants that I was introduced to early in my career by a veteran detective named Danny Ramirez, who identified Max to me as his confidential informant, and that was all I knew him by. At the time, I had no idea that Max Gonzalez had actually been arrested and charged with trafficking, federally charged with trafficking, and that he was a felon. I had no idea that he was a felon. I had no reason to check to see if he was a felon because he wasn't my confidential informant. He was Danny's confidential informant and Steve Altangi's confidential informant. He was not mine. I invested crimes against children. I had no reason for confidential informants. So when Max called me, initially he was looking for Danny. And then at that time, Danny had just gone through a scandal where he tested positive for cocaine pursuant to an FBI investigation, and him and Steve Altangi were charged with conspiracy, or I don't know what. They're not cops anymore is what it boils down to. They got caught committing criminal misconduct. So Danny was no longer a detective. However, those within the hierarchy of the city knew that I knew Max, and they also knew that he was related to my ex-wife, and that if he had a child in the mix, that I would more than likely help him if he reached out to me. So when Max called me, he didn't call me and say, I'm a felon, I need help getting a gun. Never said that. So what they needed for me to do was agree to give him a gun and then prove that I had the foreknowledge that he was a felon. Well, as the conversations progressed, it became very clear that I had no knowledge he was a felon. In fact, at the very end of one of the conversations, I say clearly, and they left it on the recording, I say, you're a felon? I didn't know you were a felon. I didn't know you went to prison. I knew you'd been arrested for DUI, but I had no idea you were a felon. And that's when I told him, you can't have a gun. Well, that part was edited right out of the recording. And they edited that out, and if you listen to it, you can hear the edits. When they finally gave me the recording that they were using as evidence against me to prosecute me, I took it to audio engineers. The audio engineers I took it to were able to find 130 or more edits in a 15-minute recording. Clearly, that evidence had been tampered with. Now, last I checked, tampering with evidence is a felony offense. Now, depending on who did it, you would think the U.S. Department of Justice would swoop in and make arrests for tampering with evidence like this, but nothing has happened yet, and I can explain why later. So at any rate, they wanted to have evidence that would cause a reasonable person to believe that I had foreknowledge that Max was a felon, and that I knew that he needed the gun to commit a crime, and that I had agreed to provide it to him with this foreknowledge. That was the whole basis for everything that they brought against me. They had to prove that, but it was hard for them to prove. So they needed to stack the cards in their favor. So they had to make sure that they withheld the evidence from me so I couldn't properly challenge it, which is what they did. I didn't get my IA file or the recordings of that evidence being used against me until I had already been fired, and years later, after I filed a federal tort claim against the city, I finally got my IA file, which is a huge violation of my due process rights under the 14th Amendment for equal protection of laws. But putting that aside, this is the kind of behavior that these people at the city of Santa Fe engage in every day. I saw it happen every day, and I used to bring it to a stop every day. Every time they tried to do this to an employee, withhold evidence or violate their due process, or have closed doors meetings with a hearing officer and decide beforehand what the result would be before actually having the hearing, I'd bring that to a screeching halt, and I would claim due process violations. So I was a thorn in the flesh to them. So what did they do? They did it to me. Now, how were they able to accomplish this? Well, by the time they did it to me, they had already procured alliances with my union. My own union turned on me. My own union board had already sworn allegiance to administration to sell me out, and they denied me union representation during these proceedings. So they had already bought out the current union president, the vice president, the treasurer, the hearing officer. Every member on the union board had already been bought and paid for to turn on me and deny me union representation. That's how they were able to accomplish it. So when this was happening to me, and I followed protocols, and I requested a predetermination hearing, which was another kangaroo court. I wasn't allowed to cross-examine witnesses, or I wasn't allowed access to my IA file. Then I submitted a request for an appeal to the city manager, and it was denied because the union didn't back me. They simply denied my appeal. End of story. And I was fired. They fed it to the media immediately. I was portrayed as the cop that got caught on tape agreeing to, in one case, the story was that I had agreed to sell a gun to a felon. He stated in his news report one evening that I was caught selling a gun to a known criminal who committed a murder with the gun. That was on the news as if it actually occurred. And that was used as a basis to decertify me with the Department of Public Safety, even though it was false. I didn't sell anybody a gun, I didn't give anybody a gun, and no murder was ever committed. Nobody was ever in danger of being harmed because it was a setup. It was a police sting that was being courted. It was an entrapment operation is what it was. It wasn't even a sting. It was an entrapment, which is another crime. I had no predisposition to sell guns to anybody, and I had no predisposition to sell guns particularly to confidential informants. So there was no reason for anyone to believe that I would sell or give or provide a gun to anybody. They simply figured that that would be the best angle to get me to commit some kind of misconduct because Max mentioned his daughter was in danger. Now keep in mind, I don't know what their intent was. I'm guessing here. I believe their intent was to actually trick me into providing Max with a gun. After several months of them trying and failing in this entrapment operation, they went back to the guys at the city and said, look, this is what we have. He's not biting it. He's not biting it. He's not taking the bait. So they said, well, what do we have? Well, the best we have is him saying things. Let's see if we can get him to say something. So they continued having Max call me unsupervised. They simply gave him a recorder and had him call me at his convenience to record conversations between he and I. So for the next several months, he would call me and ask me a bunch of weird questions and try to hope that he got some good footage that they could splice in there and use to give the appearance of impropriety, such that it would make sense to everybody that I should no longer be a police officer anymore. I believe that's what they wound up doing in the end, because they couldn't get me to commit a crime. Now, I can tell you why they didn't get me to commit a crime, because police officers, including federal agents, are trained to set up sting operations that appeal to the criminal mind. I know because I've been through that training. It's part of the criminal profiling. You set up a sting based on probable cause and a predisposition. You get it approved by a judge, by a commander through a case plan, and then you set it up such that it appeals to the criminal element in the criminal mind. It did not work with me because I am not a criminal. I have no compunction or inclination to commit criminal acts. That's why it did not work with me. In addition to that, I was very suspicious that Max, who I knew was a confidential informant, would be calling a police officer, detective in my case, and asking for help to procure a weapon. I thought that was odd why he would call me. Especially because he stopped mentioning his daughter and wanted me to talk about weapons more and more and more. I became suspicious, and in the end I told him to simply just leave me alone and stop calling me. It was after that I was hit with a target letter because they felt as though they had enough to go after me and retaliate against me for having reported other crimes committed by police officers on duty. The entrapment operation failed miserably. That's why the U.S. Attorney's Office refused to pursue it. That's why I was never arrested. Had I actually committed a crime or behaved to that level of misconduct such that it was actually conspiracy to commit a crime or conspiracy to provide a gun to a known felon, I would have been arrested. Simple. Any district court judge would have signed off on that. Any DA would have signed off on that. It's because I did not actually agree to do any of that, and they had to splice a tape together such that it would hold up in a tribunal, but not in a court of law. That entrapment operation failed miserably. They wanted to put me in prison. They wanted to put me in jail. That was what they were trying to do. And they failed miserably, again, because I'm not a criminal. And I'm not inclined to commit criminal acts. In fact, if you look at my criminal history, I have none. I've never been arrested. I've never been charged with a crime. I don't even have a traffic ticket. I have a clean record. Yet, I was decertified for life. I can never be a police officer again in the state of New Mexico for the rest of my life, thanks to Mark Radosevich, the hearing officer at Department of Public Safety, and to Gary King, the Attorney General, who sat on the board, the Law Enforcement Academy board, with several of the chiefs and the members of that board, who voted unanimously without even looking at any evidence of the tribunal. They voted unanimously to decertify me for life. And I never committed a crime, and I never even got arrested. Yet we have officers walking the streets. In the city of Santa Fe, officers are allowed to retire who test positive for cocaine, who commit rape, who expose themselves to females and victimize females, who tamper with evidence and hide evidence and steal from people and commit police brutality. They are allowed to still be police officers and retire and draw retirement and maintain their certification. The main agency was the City of Santa Fe Police Department, the administrators. They recruited members who were assigned to the Region 3 Narcotics Task Force. Now, the Region 3 Narcotics Task Force is federally funded, but it is made up of several members of different agencies in the surrounding area. And they recruited the Region 3 Narcotics Task Force members to engage in this illegal entrapment operation. Now, that includes members from New Mexico State Police, City of Santa Fe Police Department, Santa Fe County, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and at the very end, the FBI. In addition, they involved high-ranking officials at the Department of Public Safety, district court, DAs and district court judges, members of my own police union as part of this, to make sure that I had no support and no leg to stand on if I didn't just resign or quit and I wanted to contest or oppose this that was being brought against me.